Welcome to the Commercial Awareness Compass. This is your weekly guide to developing your commercial awareness in a way that goes beyond just the news. Each week, we focus on one major news story, breaking it down to help you build your understanding at 3 levels: beginner, intermediate, and advanced. We'll break down today's story in a way that's easy for you to follow and gives you practical insights to use in your applications and interviews. I'm Tori, I'm a future trainee solicitor, and I'm joined today by Emma, an experienced commercial lawyer. Today, we'll focus on the plans for a new theme park in the UK. So I'm looking forward to this discussion. As we go through the beginner, intermediate, and advanced levels, I encourage our viewers to focus on how each explanation builds upon the last. So start by understanding the basics of the story and the terms that we are considering, then think about how businesses and industries are impacted, and finally, you'll explore the strategic thinking that goes into helping clients manage these challenges. So let's get into it, Emma. Let's start at the beginner level. Could you please just give us an overview of the story that we are discussing?
Of course I can, and good to be back again. Nice to see everybody again, those that are tuning in. Thank you, Tori, for introducing this story. So yes, we are discussing the opening of a new universal theme park in Europe. It's the first of its kind in Europe, and we are getting it in the UK near Bedford. It's a 476-acre site, and it's a major development, and it's expected to attract millions of visitors, as you would expect. It's going to stimulate the local economy. Universal, lots of you will know, is a well-known brand, but not only a well-known brand in each of the nations that it's known within, it's global, of course. And this new theme park will be a key attraction for the European tourism industry, trying to bring us along with that US level. So looking forward to talking about this today and why it's relevant for those interested in commercial awareness and the law.
Yeah, that sounds great. Thanks so much. It sounds like it will be a major project. So something I wanted to highlight at the beginning, because I looked at the story very briefly before we hopped on the call, is that this project is expected to complete in 2031, I think, or something like that. So a long-term project. So I thought maybe could you say something just at the start about what might be different about this being such a long-term project, and then maybe how that might make it extra interesting to the people tuning in?
Of course I can. Great research there, Tori. It is due to open in 2031, and it's really interesting that you've mentioned it at the start as well, because it's really helpful for our audience to keep in mind what we're discussing today, because it is such a long-term project and we're getting a heads up like 6 years before. And who knows how long some lawyers or some in the know have been working on this for prior to this point. It's really interesting because if you think there might be some legal work starting or already starting, you know, we're talking about this publicly. There's been an announcement in the news. Let's think about how, as lawyers, you'll be working on a longer term project such as this as well. There'll be lots of different opportunities to work on long-term projects. And I think sometimes, especially at the junior level, you expect to be working on a legal task with a client, and then you hand it back and then you work on something else and there's different things. But if you've got a longer term client and you're really getting your teeth stuck into a project like this, and you've got the opportunity to support a partner or a supervisor on something like this, it's really cool. It's really rewarding to be able to do that. Not only is it great for your career, you've also got to think about the developments in law that would happen during that time too. So like I say, things that are in place now or were in place a couple of years ago might change. So your legal advice and some of the things that we're talking about today, if Tori and I were to deliver this session in 2030, for example, there'd be other things to think about, which is why it's so interesting from a commercial awareness point of view to try and think about what's in front of us, but also try and think to the future. We can't do it all of the time, don't get me wrong. But do keep in mind as we go through, as Tori mentioned, that it's going to be a longer term thing, this, and the legal advice will flow along with that timeline. So it's interesting to make sure that's in front of mind when we're discussing things today.
Thanks for highlighting that. I think it actually is such a great thing to flag that what you pointed out about how when the project is about to be completed, the law will likely be different than it was at the outset of the project. So I think it really just does emphasize why it is so important to be working on that commercial awareness and keeping on top of developments in the news and in the law, which I think is a great beginner insight for us to focus on, actually, because that I think is something that our viewers and listeners can apply to other commercial stories that they see as well, if they're looking at something that is a long-term project too. Before we move on from the beginner level, I thought it would be helpful if we go over some of the key terms that we're talking about, some of the key areas of law that are engaged, so that make sure that all of our viewers are familiar with those basics. If you wanted to just go over some of the things that you think people need to know.
Of course, yeah, happily. So obviously various legal elements that businesses and law firms will need to consider with a project such as this. You've got local regulation, environmental law, employment law, and intellectual property. For those that have watched the previous compasses, you will know already. You'll be a bit clued up on some of those terms that I've mentioned. If you haven't, I would highly recommend, by the way, that you go and catch up. But anyway, I will just recap some of those terms just to make sure that we know where we are at the beginner stage, because you'll need to be able to navigate legal issues like those when you're working in practice. So if we start with IP, intellectual property, main thing here, I guess, will be licensing agreements. So Universal may need to license its brand, the characters and the IP that it owns to like local businesses, maybe hotels, shops, restaurants. A lawyer will draft those contracts and we'll get onto that in the intermediate stage. But if you think that one of the announcements that we've had is that the theme park will likely feature James Bond, Paddington, Lord of the Rings, it gets more complicated because there'll be other IP owners within those. So think of the author of Lord of the Rings, think it's Tolkien. They might have some right in it as too. So you've got to think about those nuances under IP. Think about the rides, the actual construction of the rides, but also the design of them. Some rides might be able to be purchased off the shelf from a manufacturer. Some might be bespoke, and Universal will want to have some sort of surprise in there for the marketing. So who are they being purchased from? What goes behind that? It's a contract and it's a construction element there. Environmental compliance, you're going to face scrutiny regarding environmental laws and regulations. Of course, you've got to be in line with those. So that's another key term. And then public liability. Sadly, you have to think about the risk of accidents and injuries and insurance, and how lawyers can advise on that liability depending on what side, you are on of the negotiation. Insurance, safety protocols, waivers, things like that, all in the bounds of the law. So seems like it's quite heavy for beginner, but just keep those terms in mind because we will unpick them as we go through today.
Great. Thanks so much for outlining that. I think, now that we have this basic understanding of what the story is and what are some of the terms that people need to know, I think we can move on to the intermediate stage, which is at this point, this is when we'll start thinking about how our business is affected, why do they care about something like this, and then how do lawyers assist as well. So I actually thought we could start with this idea of why businesses care. And you said something at the beginner stage that I thought was really interesting, that some of our listeners maybe had not thought of, because I actually hadn't thought of in the few minutes I spent thinking about this story, is about how it's not only the company which is seeking to launch this theme park that will be affected. You mentioned that other companies are involved as well, potentially hotels or things like that. So could you speak a little bit more about these kind of wider commercial impacts?
Of course. So when you think tourism, it should take you to, of course, the project that we're looking at, like the actual theme park itself, but how that's going to impact the wider area. Something that came to mind for me, just to use as a comparison, because sometimes if I struggle to understand the impact of something, I try and relate it to something else, and it's kind of a consultant's trick. Actually, it's what consultants do, try and find something similar, but you can do it with the law. So if you think about the Harry Potter experience, for example, in Watford, and then everything that's come out of that, so the surrounding restaurants, of course, are going to get much more business, and they might want to be able to benefit on the back of the Harry Potter experience. And there's also shops, and there's merchandise, and there's lots of things that come out of the actual experience itself, which means other businesses benefit from. But other businesses aren't in the same family or camp, let's say, as Universal. So yes, they're going to all want to be friends and collaborate, but they're not the same business, and they will have different competing, perhaps, interests. Some might disagree with that tourism element because it might mean that individuals that are going to the Universal theme park might park on their car park, in which case the hotel might want to put restrictions there. So it's thinking a little bit wider, and exactly as you say, Tori, the different businesses that are impacted. But if we think about the positive for now, hotels might want to have a themed Universal hotel room where they can benefit from that. But in order to do that and benefit from the footfall that the theme park is providing, you know, millions and millions of attendees, hopefully, they will need to have a relationship with and a legal assurance and a contract with Universal to be able to use their brand and to be able to piggyback on the back of things, to be able to market it in a certain way to get those permissions. So it's a lot wider than you think, and also why it makes it so interesting, because you might look at exactly what this is exactly why we have the compass, right? Because you look at a headline like this and think, what have lawyers got to do with it? All of a sudden, like myself and Tori are talking about all of these like hundreds of reasons why lawyers might need to be involved. So it's a good way to also kick off intermediate and talk about the impacts everywhere else too.
Absolutely, because I think this is actually an excellent way to highlight what would differentiate a basic level of commercial awareness from intermediate, because it's likely at the beginner level of commercial awareness that you would recognize that lawyers would be involved in assisting with this project. But I think it is really that critical thinking at the intermediate level that would help you realize that it's not just the business of the theme park, it's all these other businesses that might also be affected, that then they would have their own legal advisors to navigate and get advice in this situation. There's a couple areas of law that you mentioned that I wanted to give you the chance to expand on if you wanted to add some more insights here. Some of the ones that I noted down was IP. So you mentioned IP, and then also insurance and contracts. That's quite broad though. So if you want to just focus on whichever one you want to start with.
Let's do IP first, because yeah, it's a nice one I think it's the most obvious that comes to mind first of all, and then we'll get on to the nitty-gritty, perhaps more dry parts, but it depends what you're into. I personally like the commercial and the insurance side, but we'll see. So yeah, IP, if we just focus on Universal for now, so let's bring it back closer so we've got a clear example of what we're talking about. Universal will need advice on how to protect its own trademarks, its own logos, its own copyrighted material in the park. How do they make sure that's not exploited, and that they don't have, you know, dupes popping up here and there and people touts outside selling t-shirts that aren't necessarily in line with the trademarks or might be possibly infringement. There's all these different things you can think about. So Universal will be wanting to make this as big a commercial and as successful and profitable a commercial venture as possible. And again, at the intermediate level, it's a great way of seeing how lawyers can have a positive impact on that commercial incoming, because you think lawyers, we just cost money, but you can, if you can protect somebody's brand from a legal point of view, they're making more money out of it. So that's why a lawyer will be involved in IP. They'll be absolutely crucial in ensuring that that IP is protected, and any potential infringements are addressed either before or ongoing. So maybe a legal advisor could give Universal, someone at the Universal brand team, a cheat sheet on steps to follow if a website pops up, for example, that alleges to sell tickets to the park and they are forfeit, you know, they're not genuine. Then what can we do? How do we get this taken down? So you can also get takedowns, as the official name of it, of websites and people that are trying to piggyback off the Universal brand as a result of this, because unfortunately people do. So that's IP. I'll pause there, Tori, in case you've got questions, or if you want me to move on to the next one, I don't mind.
No, I didn't have questions other than just to say that, yeah, that was super interesting. I think that you outlined really helpfully the different ways in which lawyers support as well, because you have this, on the one hand, lawyers supporting in a proactive way of giving that kind of advice of how to avoid those kind of situations. But then also, if situations like that occur, then how lawyers can assist as well. So I think that was just a really great overview. So thank you for that. The next thing, I had mentioned insurance, but I actually wondered, did you want to talk about insurance in the advanced level? Do you think it's more advanced, or do you think it fits here in intermediate?
We could do. I'll touch upon it briefly in the commercial contracty sense here, and then yes, actually invoking insurance we'll get to in advance. It's a good idea. But no pressure. You've bigged me up there and said I did IP well, so I'm gonna have to try and do this next one well. But yeah, if we think about like the commercial contracts and the insurancy part, there's contracts everywhere that you look, guys, everywhere. Like you walk around any, like even a supermarket, the way that places are, the way that items are placed on the shelf, it will likely be in a contract, and you wouldn't think walking around. The phone that you use, there's all sorts of legal implications to it, and it's exactly the same thing for the theme park. So if you can just imagine yourself, put yourself in a future lawyer's position, walking around this theme park, and trust me, this will happen if it doesn't already, you should be able to point at things and say, oh, there's a contract behind that, there's a contract behind that, there's an implied term there, there'll be an express term that would have been negotiated. And if that isn't already driving you crazy at the moment, it will be, trust me. The law is everywhere. What I would recommend doing is, again, just putting yourself in the theme park and thinking, well, what contract will be in place? And as soon as you enter the theme park, you've got the employment contract, of course, with the person that's serving you. But you as an individual have entered into a contract with the theme park, and there'll be signs everywhere. That's a contract. When you park, there's a contract there. So it's everything that is involved with those things, the drafting and the signing of those, a lawyer will be across it. But then, as Tori mentioned, you've got the continuous part. Once that contract's signed, it's not filed away and gone. A lawyer will be looking at the term of the agreement. Is it 3 years fixed? Is it 3 years with an option to be extended? Is it automatically extended? What happens when it's automatically extended? Are the fees the same? Do they increase by a certain amount? You've got the future side of it as well. It will be constantly be scrutinized by a lawyer and trying to make the best out of it for the party that you're acting for. And both sides do that. And there'll be lots of things to think about. So you've got the ongoing thing there. And then linked to insurance, of course, there's a lot more to this. We'll get into it. But policies are not in place indefinitely. The park will need ongoing insurance. If it doesn't have that, it will shut down. So you need a lawyer involved within those things. And if you don't have a decent legal, like strategic advisor, then imagine being that lawyer that's responsible, not to put pressure on you, but that hasn't flagged that the insurance policy is, expiring, and then all of a sudden you get a notification to say you can't keep the park open. So another way that lawyers can help with commercial interests, but also making sure that the insurance terms are all legit and in line with regulation ongoing, is something to think about too.
Yeah, thanks so much. Two things I wanted to highlight there. The first being that I just love your suggestion about working on your commercial awareness by just walking around looking for where the contracts are. I think, that's just a perfect way to demonstrate as well how I think, studying law or working in law just like alters your brain chemistry. Then you're seeing these things everywhere. But I think that's excellent. That's so the way to develop your commercial awareness, and just to be really recognizing those things. The second thing, which I do think leads us on nicely into the advanced stage, is because I think you really helpfully identified there that even though at the moment we're talking about this project in terms of leading up to when the park will open, of course that is not the end of it. Then this park will be running, and then these contracts will exist, and they will be ongoing, and there's the potential for new issues or questions to arise. So you highlighted the importance of having a strategic legal advisor in that circumstance, which takes us perfectly into the advanced level, because that's really what we're looking at the advanced level, is how can lawyers provide this strategic advice and be thinking proactively, long-term, big picture. Let's move into the advanced stage. And then this is also quite broad, but did you want to just say a little bit more about how lawyers can be helpful in providing this kind of strategic advice in a context like this?
Of course, yeah. So now we're nicely bringing everything together with the long-term element, what you will do in the moment and what you're thinking about in future, the risk mitigation that you might need to think about. So at the start, we introduced this, you've got to try and think ahead as much as possible. And it's hard to think ahead sometimes and imagine different scenarios, especially when it's such a long spanning thing. But that's where you really get the brownie points as that strategic advisor to a business. And if you can really impress your client with that, then therefore your employer firm or your organization is going to help your career and growth as well. So it is stretching the mind a lot. And sometimes you have to think and question things so much that it hurts, and it takes a lot of energy. People think lawyers just sit at a desk and, we've got an easy job, we don't have to do much. But the brain power that it takes to get to somewhere and think strategically and critically with things like this, it does take a lot. So if you're not quite there yet, don't, put too much pressure on yourself in regards to that, because it can be really difficult. But it's so good that we're talking about it here. I can provide some examples to bring it to life if that would be helpful for the audience. And the first one, I guess, will continue with insurance. So again, I've already mentioned that making sure insurance is there, but when you are negotiating an insurance contract for something as huge as this, you will have the power to think about the impact of different clauses within that policy. So it's not like as an individual now where we might get home insurance or travel insurance that you can't negotiate those things. We all know there's lots of carve-outs in those documents and things that you might not be able to benefit from if you do this, if you do that. But as a strategic legal advisor to a business, your bargaining power is much higher. So if you go to an insurance broker for something like this, individual insurance, let's say for public liability, you will have the power to a certain extent to be able to think about different things that might happen with the park, specifically with a ride, that you can maybe mitigate against as much as possible. So that's thinking longer term with insurance too. And then it might be that a strategic decision of Universal is to say, well, insurance broker, she says that we can't offer this within the price that we're stating because we're insuring against so much, you're asking us for a little bit more. Universal might decide their risk appetite. They might go, right, we'll throw more money at it. So we'll pay more for the insurance to get more legal protection. That's a strategic thing that you'll be expected to think about when you're at the necessary stage to do it. If you can have tiny examples like that in your mind now, you are probably going to be way ahead of the competition when you're in interviews anyway. But it's thinking about commercial trade-offs for legal risk and how you can deal with that. And then another example, which I'll explain a little bit quicker than that first one, sorry, I went into a lot of detail there, is
no, it's so helpful though.
If you think about employment, so a lawyer that isn't thinking strategically will go, oh, I've got a set of employment contracts. One is for 0 hours. I know if you're up to date with the news, that's likely to be abolished soon in a certain extent. Little hint there. One will be 0 hours, one will be fixed term, one will be shift work, one's going to be like freelance perhaps, or design work, things like that. There you go. Client, I'll send you those employment contracts. There's your pack. Yeah, great. You've done your job as an employment lawyer. But have you thought about the risk that a specific business like Universal or a hotel or hospitality might face? If you just pause and think about the workforce that you're hiring, well, what's the risk there? Well, typically it will probably be on the lower end of the pay scale if you're thinking, you know, serving in a restaurant or things like that. The turnover of staff might be higher. How are you going to keep those people in those roles? Because we know, I, as a lawyer, even though I'm a lawyer, I know, because I've got the commercial awareness and the sense to think about this, it's going to cost you, clients, a lot of money to rehire that workforce. So let's think about the commercial impact of what's in these contracts. How can we make them happy? How do we make these changes? What do I recommend to the HR business partner to say, yeah, legally, you might want as many restrictions as possible in this contract, but commercially, can you give something away like benefits or different things to offer? And let's have a look at the market. So let's have a look around this area in Bedford or the UK at what other attractions offer. And then how can we beat that? You know, that's a strategic thing that will then transpose into the contract. If as a lawyer you can do that, your value is sky high compared to where we started, which was just handing over the contracts and saying, there we go, you can do a lot more. So a few different strategic elements to think about there.
Absolutely. That was really, really helpful because I think that you illustrated so well this balance between the legal advice and the commercial advice, that really you can't just have one without the other, that the strong lawyer will take into account the commercial considerations. And I think that example of the employment contracts illustrated that really quite perfectly, where you said how you might legally want as many restrictions as possible, but then that just wouldn't be that attractive from a commercial point of view. So that was super, super helpful. I think that that is almost everything I wanted to discuss at this advanced level, because I think the explanation that you provided there really shows the balance and the importance of thinking commercially. There was one other thing that I wanted to ask about, and then we'll just open the floor as well if there's anything else that you wanted to add. I wanted to ask about the relevance of emerging areas of law or developing areas of law that, given that this is a project in 2025, are there ways in which this project would look different than some theme park development projects that maybe happened a few decades ago?
Mm-hmm. That's exactly where my mind was going when you were saying, is there going to be anything else that we should discuss right now? And it's definitely the emerging parts. And this is where I find it difficult, it doesn't matter. Tori gave me a lovely introduction and said that I was an experienced commercial lawyer, but there's always going to be points where you're like, your brain will be stretched, and this is where mine is, because where I go to with what's going to be different is technology, likely. So the advancements that we've got in technology now, there will be specialist technology lawyers that will be working on things like this, that are keeping up to date with everything that we have. But if I just think, and what I like to do is put myself in the shoes of somebody that's interviewing, and not expecting the person to know it all, but I would expect them to at least point out some of the things that might be different. So if they mention technology to me and how it might change, and it will be fine to say, well, I don't know what that's going to look like, because nobody really does, but I do know that there will be new laws as a result of it. There will be new restrictions. There might be new things to exploit and protections that we need to have. The government might get involved. And then how does that impact on my client? Universal are probably likely going to have some sort of AI experience as part of their entertainment on the park, whether it's as part of a ride or something completely different. But if you look at the laws that we've got now around safety and insurance and liability, things like that, they might not fit technology that is going to be in 2031 when this park opens. But are we going to get new laws by then? Who knows? So what lawyers are constantly doing is trying to retrofit situations into archaic laws. And a lot of you will be nodding when you're thinking of land law, or you're thinking of anything else. Some of these things that we learn about, that's no different really to what we've got coming with technology and emerging areas, especially as new experiences are expected more and more from the market. And as a consumer, there's constant competition. So again, if you can use that trick that I mentioned earlier, how do you compare it to something else? We are used to working with laws that are outdated with areas that are emerging. So if you can explain that very simply in an interview or to a client or to the organisation that you're working for, and say, I don't have all of the answers right now, but I'm very competent in knowing that things might change, the law will catch up eventually, but I've got this gap that I work within, and I'm confident in finding a way. And maybe you'll have to take a risk decision, who knows, but I, as your advisor, will advise you on how to get there. So that emerging area of technology that I don't know what is going to look like completely from a legal landscape, and nor will anybody else at the moment. There'll be people that know a lot better than I, but that's fine. You can just say, when we get there, I'll be comfortable with navigating what I've got with my research skills and everything else, and this commercial awareness hat that everyone watching now is already wearing as we're in advanced. So again, a bit of a wider stretch your brain conversation around the emerging area of tech and how that's going to impact law, but equally really beneficial to talk about, I think, Tori.
Absolutely. I think also that was a really helpful insight for interviews as well, because I remember when I started learning about commercial awareness, I had this concern of like, wait, are they going to expect me to have all of the answers? And I think especially when you're at this advanced level, then you question, oh, am I supposed to know how technology is going to change this? But really, as you've just so helpfully outlined, it's really about just being alert to the fact that these considerations are there and being aware that these things will be relevant. You can't really predict with certainty what will happen, but you need to be aware that there are things here to think about. So that was, I think, a really great insight to leave our viewers with, unless you had anything final that you wanted to add before we wrap up.
One small thing, because it's not very often that this gets to arise in the conversations that we have. So for those that are interested in M&A, which is mergers and acquisitions, and I've deliberately kept this till last because it's quite a big topic. But strategically, if you're advising someone like Universal or a surrounding business that are going to be impacted by this huge venture, thinking future, what's the intention for some of the businesses that are involved? Are they intending on merging with others, or acquiring, or being acquired, or having someone have a different commercial interest in it? Do we need more shareholders? Do we need more investment? Things like that. It's a really good one to explore. So for those that are interested in M&A in that sense, and again, it's a tricky and wide area of law to get into situations as a junior lawyer perhaps, but if you can mention it and be twigged on that as a final note, or if we could also think about and ask the right questions of the client, it might not be on your mind right now, but are you intending to sell off part of this business eventually, or do you want somebody else to run a certain element of the park or the experience? You don't have to run it all yourself. You can imagine the complexity that will come with the law as a result of that, but it's very interesting. So think about M&A, and those that are interested in it, this is a real life conversation that you could have around advising a client like this.
Thank you. I think that was a nice extra gift to leave anyone who has stayed until the end then, because I hadn't thought of M&A either, but I think a lot of people are really interested in M&A as an area of law as well. So thanks for leaving us with that bonus tidbit. I think that wraps up. So just to our listeners and viewers, thank you for joining today's Commercial Awareness Compass. Remember always that commercial awareness is more than just staying on top of the news. So you're not just regurgitating the headlines or what you read. You're really trying to understand why events matter and why these events matter to clients, and how you as a future lawyer can provide strategic value. So whether you're at the beginner, intermediate, or advanced level, you always want to be asking yourself, how does this impact clients, and what would a law firm do to help? That's a mindset that will help you stand out in your interviews and on the job. So that's all from us today. Join us next week to keep building your commercial awareness. And until then, prepare without the panic.